In May 1987, a single spark on the Chinese-Soviet border unleashed the largest wildfire humanity has ever seen. 18 million acres burned in less than 4 weeks, entire villages erased, more than 1,000 lives lost. Yet, outside a few broken records, the Black Dragon fire remains almost forgotten, drowned out by censorship and chaos. How did the biggest wildfire in history fade from global memory, and could those same conditions return? This is where the story truly begins. Spring 1987 arrived in the forests of the Greater Khingan Range with an uneasy silence. Months without rain had left the ground brittle and the air raw. Moisture levels in the pine and larch forests dropped below 10%, turning the landscape into a vast tinderbox. Underfoot, a thick carpet of dead needles and branches, left behind by years of unchecked logging, crackled with every step. In the logging camps, workers like Wang Fusheng noticed how even the morning dew failed to settle, how a single match could ignite a pile of brush in seconds. Winds swept down from Siberia, gusting up to 45 kilometers per hour. These were not gentle breezes, but powerful currents that could whip a spark into a wall of flame in minutes. Every gust seemed to pull the forest tighter, drawing moisture from the trunks and scattering brittle debris across the slopes. The Amur River Valley, usually a natural barrier, offered little resistance as the wind funneled through, carrying dust and the scent of resin far across the border. The forest itself was wounded. Decades of clear-cutting had left open scars, with piles of slash and abandoned timber dotting the hillsides. No replanting followed the saws. Instead, sunlight poured onto the forest floor, drying it further with each passing day. Fire breaks, where they existed, were narrow furrows lost in the undergrowth, barely enough to slow a grass fire, much less a blaze driven by drought and wind. In the logging settlements, homes and depots stood close together, built from the same pine that filled the forests. Water supplies were limited, and firefighting equipment was basic buckets, shovels, and a handful of outdated pumps. The radio crackled with warnings, but few grasped how quickly the balance could tip. Each afternoon, as the wind rose and the sun baked the hillsides, the risk grew. By early May, the forests of Heilongjiang and the borderlands of Siberia had become a single unbroken fuse. All it would take was one careless spark. At dawn on May 18, a single spark leapt from a brush cutter in the heart of the Greater Khingan Forest. Within hours, flames raced through the treetops, fanned by winds that roared out of Siberia. The fire surged north, consuming the brittle remains of old logging camps and the dry needles carpeting the forest floor. By the afternoon, the blaze had reached the Amur River, the winding border between China and the Soviet Union, a line that, for centuries, had divided empires. That day, it divided nothing at all. On the Soviet side, border guard Anatoly Kuznetsov stood watch in his observation post, scanning the horizon for smugglers or stray wildlife. Instead, he saw a wall of smoke rising above the black pines, thick enough to blot out the sun. The firestorm crossed the river in a single sweep, embers carried on the wind landing deep in Russian territory. In minutes, the taiga was alight, the flames moving faster than any man could run. Kuznetsov radioed his command post, voice cracking as he tried to describe what he saw. A front of fire stretching 40 kilometers wide, advancing with a sound like distant thunder. On both sides of the border, the response was frantic but hopelessly outmatched. Soviet patrols watched as the firestorm jumped natural barriers, igniting everything in its path. Chinese villages along the river emptied, families fleeing with what they could carry. In the confusion, lines of communication broke down. The border, once patrolled and fortified, became invisible beneath the smoke and chaos. By May 20, the fire front spanned more than 40 kilometers, devouring forest and settlement alike. Aerial surveillance reported flames advancing at speeds never before recorded in the region. Firefighters on the ground found themselves surrounded, their equipment useless against the sheer scale and ferocity. The blaze ignored boundaries, policies, and human plans. In less than 48 hours, a local disaster had become a cross-border emergency, one that neither nation was prepared to contain. In the weeks after the flames swept through the Greater Khingan forests, the scale of loss became impossible to ignore. Villages that had stood for generations vanished in a single afternoon, their wooden homes reduced to blackened frames. More than 33,000 people found themselves without shelter, forced to leave behind everything but what they could carry in their arms. Roads clogged with families on foot and battered trucks loaded with bedding, chickens, and the few valuables that could be salvaged. The air, thick with ash, carried the sounds of children crying for lost pets and elders searching for neighbors who never made it out. Among the displaced was Chen Lian, a logging camp cook who had lived her whole life in the forest. She recalled the moment the sky turned orange, the wind driving embers sideways through the settlement. With no warning, she and her son fled into the river shallows, the only refuge from the heat. Hours passed as they watched their home burn from the water, the smoke so dense it blotted out the sun. When the fire finally moved on, nothing familiar remained, just a wasteland of scorched earth and twisted metal. Stories like Chen's echoed up and down the Amur Valley. Some families walked for days to reach makeshift camps, guided only by the memory of where roads once ran. Aid was slow to arrive, food and clean water ran short, and rumors spread about missing relatives and unmarked graves in the ruins. The official numbers, thousands homeless, hundreds dead, could not capture the sense of dislocation that settled over the survivors. For many, the fire was not just a natural disaster, but an erasure of community and history. The world outside would soon move on, but for those left behind, the loss would linger for years. Official records of the Black Dragon fire remain scattered and incomplete. In 1987, both China and the Soviet Union controlled information tightly, each for their own reasons. News of the disaster filtered out in fragments. Chinese state media focused on heroism and punishment, while Soviet outlets barely acknowledged the event at all. International coverage was limited to brief wire reports, often lacking detail or context. The world's attention was fixed elsewhere: Cold War tensions, the aftermath of Chernobyl, and domestic upheaval in both countries. In this void, the scale of the fire faded from global memory. Decades later, the physical evidence is still visible. Charcoal layers in the soil of the Greater Khingan forests run meters deep, marking the path of the flames. Satellite data, analyzed years after the fact, confirm that the Black Dragon fire consumed over 7.3 million hectares in China and as much as 15 million more in Siberia. By comparison, Australia's Black Summer fires of 2019 to 2020, widely reported as unprecedented, burned just 18 million hectares, but only as a sum of hundreds of separate blazes. The Black Dragon fire was a single, continuous inferno. Dr. Rin Sokolov, a climate historian, points to the conditions that made this disaster possible: extreme drought, relentless winds, and a landscape stripped of resilience by decades of logging. These patterns are no longer rare. In the past 10 years, Siberia and Canada have seen boreal wildfires on a scale once thought impossible. The climate signals are clear: longer droughts, hotter summers, and more combustible forests. The Black Dragon fire is not just a relic of the past, but a warning. As the world grows warmer and drier, the risk of another forgotten megafire grows with it, hidden until the next spark finds its fuel. Today, wildfires are growing in scale as drought and heat waves intensify worldwide. The Black Dragon fire stands as a warning. No forest is immune, and no society is out of reach. What we choose to remember or forget shapes how prepared we truly are. Share your thoughts below.